Somewhere in America right now, a pizza is coming out of an oven, and there is a better than 1 in 3 chance it is topped with pepperoni. It is the single most popular pizza topping in the country, curling into little grease-cupped discs on more pies than mushroom, sausage, and extra cheese combined. Ask most people where it comes from, and they will shrug and say Italy. Obviously, the way they assume spaghetti and meatballs came off a boat from Naples fully formed. But here is the strange part. Pepperoni, the spicy, oily, paprika-red staple of American pizza night, has almost no ancestor in Italian food history at all. There is no dusty village in Calabria with a 500-year-old recipe for it. No grandmother's cellar hung with pepperoni salami passed down since the Renaissance. The truth is stranger, and it involves immigrant butchers improvising with unfamiliar cuts of meat. A food industry that mass-manufactured an entire culinary tradition from scratch. Government inspectors cracking down on secret chemical preservatives, and a shortage scare that once had pizza chains publicly rationing their supply. So where did this thing actually come from? Not where you think. And by the time we get to the end of this, you will never look at a pepperoni pizza the same way again. To understand why the pepperoni myth is so easy to believe, you have to understand just how real and how old Italian meat-curing culture actually is. Italy has been salting, drying, and preserving pork for centuries, and the country's regional charcuterie is not some marketing invention, but a genuine, deeply rooted craft passed down through families and guilds. Walk into a salumeria in Bologna or Parma, and you will find hanging links of sopressata, coils of finocchiona studded with fennel seed, dark, dense rounds of Calabrian sopressata that pack real heat, and prosciutto legs curing in cellars for a year or more before anyone is allowed to slice them. Salami, plural salumi, is not one product, but an entire vocabulary of technique, with each region jealously guarding its own ratios of fat to lean meat, its own spice blends, its own casings, and its own curing times. This is a tradition that predates refrigeration entirely, born out of necessity in a world without freezers, where salt, air, and time were the only tools available to keep a pig from going to waste. Butchers, called Norsini, developed such a reputation for their craft that the profession itself became legendary, with skilled pork butchers traveling from town to town, practicing a trade so refined it earned its own name. Given all of that, it is not hard to see why Americans, encountering a spicy red sausage on their pizza, would simply assume it's slotted into this ancient lineage. One more link in a chain stretching back through centuries of Italian culinary heritage. It looks the part. It tastes like it belongs to that world of cured pork and patient tradition. It has an Italian-sounding name. Surely, the thinking goes, some immigrant simply packed the family recipe in a trunk and brought it across the Atlantic unchanged. That assumption feels so natural that almost nobody bothers to check it. And that is exactly the problem. Because the moment you actually go looking for pepperoni's ancestor on Italian soil, in the salumerias of Calabria, the meat markets of Naples, or the historical records of Italian gastronomy, you find something unsettling. It is not there. Not the specific product, not the name attached to it, not even a close cousin that Italians themselves would recognize as the same food. The trail that seems like it should lead straight back to the old country simply goes cold. Something does not add up, and that gap between assumption and evidence is exactly where the real story begins. Here is the first crack in the legend, and it is a linguistic one. Ask an Italian what pepperoni means, and they will not picture a spicy cured sausage curled up on a pizza, they will picture a vegetable. In Italian, pepperoni simply means bell peppers, plural, the crunchy, sweet-fleshed things you would roast, stuff, or toss into a summer salad. Walk into a market in Rome and ask for pepperoni, and the vendor will hand you a bag of red and yellow peppers, not a stick of dry, cured meat. There is no confusion on this point among native speakers, no regional dialect where the word secretly doubles as sausage slang. The word Americans use for their favorite pizza topping is, in its country of supposed origin, a produce item. That alone should stop you in your tracks. Imagine discovering that hot dog, in its home country, just meant a dog that was overheated. That is roughly the scale of the mistranslation we are dealing with. But the word problem is only the beginning. Even if you set aside the name entirely and simply search Italy's enormous, genuinely ancient catalogue of cured pork products for something that behaves like American pepperoni, tastes like it, or is produced like it, you come up empty. Soppressata is coarse, garlicky, often studded with visible chunks of fat, and varies wildly from region to region. Finocchiona leans on fennel, not fire. Andouille, the closest thing Calabria has to a genuinely spicy cured pork product, is a soft, spreadable paste made with local chili peppers, meant to be smeared on bread, not sliced thin and laid across melted cheese. None of these are a small, uniform, deep red stick of finely ground pork and beef, heavily seasoned with paprika and cayenne, engineered to curl and crisp at the edges under high heat. That specific combination of texture, color, and heat simply does not exist in the traditional Italian repertoire. Food historians who have gone digging for a direct ancestor have consistently come back with the same answer. There isn't one. No regional salum, no historical recipe, no dusty reference in an old Italian cookbook lines up cleanly with what American diners understand pepperoni to be. What you are left with, once the myth collapses, is a curious inversion of the origin story most people assume. Pepperoni was not carried into America fully formed, a treasured heirloom recipe smuggled across the ocean in a family's memory. It was assembled here, out of Italian technique, but distinctly non-Italian ingredients and intentions, by people who were improvising in a new country with new expectations, new regulations, and new cuts of meat available to them. In other words, pepperoni is not an ancient food that migrated. It is a new food that migration itself produced, an invention born on American soil from Italian hands, which makes it, in its own strange way, one of the most American foods there is. So if pepperoni was not smuggled across the Atlantic in someone's memory, where did it actually come from? The trail leads to the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of New York City in the early 20th century. Places like Mulberry Street and East Harlem, where Italian butchers set up shop among tenements packed with people trying to figure out how to eat well on very little money, in a country that did not sell the cuts of meat they were used to back home. Picture a narrow storefront, sawdust on the floor, links of sausage hanging from hooks in the window, the smell of garlic and curing salt thick in the air. The butcher behind the counter is often a first or second generation Italian American, sometimes fresh off a boat from Calabria or Campania, sometimes born in New York to parents who were. He knows the old techniques, the slow curing, the careful balance of fat and salt his father or grandfather taught him. But he is not working with the same pigs, the same climate, or the same customers. He is working with American hogs, industrial-scale slaughterhouses, and a clientele that increasingly includes non-Italian Americans who want something bold, something that announces itself on the tongue. This is where the outsider entrepreneur enters the story, not as a single named inventor with a patent and a plaque, but as a whole class of small operators experimenting independently, in dozens of shops, arriving at similar answers because they were solving the same problem. What cuts of pork and beef were cheap and plentiful? What spices were available in an American market that stocked paprika and ground chili more readily than some of the specific peppers used in southern Italian curing? And what flavor would make an American customer, raised on comparatively bland cured meats like bologna and other lunch loaf products, sit up and take notice? The answer these butchers landed on, again and again, was a beef and pork blend, finely ground rather than the coarse chop of a traditional sopressata, stuffed into casings and laced heavily with paprika and cayenne for color and heat. Then dried and smoked using equipment adapted to American production speeds, rather than the slow, cave-aged patience of the old country. It was cheaper to make than a whole prosciutto leg, faster to bring to market than a proper dry cured salame, and it hit a flavor profile that Italian immigrants recognized as familiar, while non-Italian customers experienced as excitingly foreign. Nobody was trying to invent a national icon. They were trying to sell sausage to their neighbors and stay in business. That is, quite often, how the biggest food revolutions actually happen, not through grand vision, but through small, stubborn, commercially minded improvisation, repeated by enough people in enough shops that a genuinely new product quietly emerges and starts spreading before anyone thinks to name it, patent it, or write down who made it first. For decades, pepperoni stayed exactly what it started as, a neighborhood product, made in small batches behind the counter of an Italian-run butcher shop, sold to people who lived within walking distance of where it hung to cure. That changed when the American meatpacking industry itself changed, and pepperoni got swept up in the transformation, along with everything else in the American diet. The engine of that change was consolidation. Small, family-run slaughterhouses and curing rooms gave way to enormous, centralized meatpacking operations capable of processing hogs and cattle on a scale no immigrant butcher shop could ever match. Where a Mulberry Street shopkeeper might cure a few dozen sausages a week by hand, an industrial plant could produce thousands in a single shift, using standardized cuts, standardized spice blends, and standardized casings shipped in from suppliers rather than sourced locally. This was not unique to pepperoni. It was happening across the entire American food system, as companies discovered that the same efficiencies of scale that had transformed steel and automobiles could be applied to sausage. But pepperoni was particularly well suited to the shift, because unlike a whole cured ham that demanded months of aging in a controlled cellar, pepperoni was already a fast, formulaic product built for speed. Industrial food science simply made it faster and more consistent. Refrigeration technology was the other half of the equation. Mechanical refrigeration and improved cold chain logistics meant that cured meat no longer had to be produced and consumed within the same neighborhood, or even the same city. A sausage cured in a plant in the Midwest could now be packed, chilled, and shipped across state lines without spoiling, opening up a national market that simply had not existed for a small batch ethnic specialty food a generation earlier. Food scientists, meanwhile, went to work on the recipe itself, standardizing fermentation times, moisture content, and spice ratios so that a pepperoni made in one factory tasted essentially identical to one made 1,000 miles away. That consistency mattered enormously, because it meant a product could now carry a brand name and a promise: buy this bag and you know exactly what you are getting. every single time. Think about what that actually required. It required turning a food built on regional variation, personal recipe, and individual butcher's judgment into something closer to an industrial specification, with defined inputs and predictable outputs, the same way a factory might standardize a bolt or a light bulb. That is a strange thing to do to a sausage with immigrant roots in someone's family recipe. And it is exactly what happened. The dry-cured artisanal product of the Italian immigrant butcher shop became, over the following decades, an assembly line commodity, engineered for shelf stability, uniform slicing, and mass distribution. And crucially, this standardized, mass-producible pepperoni arrived just in time to meet a hungry new market that was about to explode across the American landscape, one that would turn this obscure ethnic sausage into the most recognizable pizza topping in the country. So who was hungry for pizza, exactly? Ask most Americans before 1940 what a pizza was, and you would likely have gotten a blank stare. It existed almost entirely within Italian immigrant enclaves in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, sold in a handful of storefronts to people who already knew what it was. Then came the war. American soldiers stationed in Italy during the campaign returned home with a craving they could not quite explain to their neighbors, a memory of flatbread, tomato, and cheese eaten in Naples or Sicily that stuck with them long after they took off the uniform. Veterans came home talking about this strange, delicious food, and small pizzerias began popping up outside the old immigrant neighborhoods to meet a demand that had never existed before on that scale. This was the moment pizza stopped being an ethnic curiosity and started becoming an American obsession. And once that transformation began, it moved fast. Pizzerias multiplied through the 1950s. Then came the franchises, the businesses that would take pizza from a neighborhood specialty to a national institution. Regional chains expanded aggressively, building standardized menus, standardized ovens, and standardized toppings that could be replicated identically whether you were in Ohio or Arizona. And here is where our sausage re-enters the story at exactly the right moment. Pepperoni, freshly industrialized, uniform, shelf-stable, and cheap to produce at scale, was the perfect topping for this new franchise model. It sliced consistently. It cooked predictably. It shipped well. It looked good under melted cheese, with that signature curl and grease-slicked shine that browned into little crisped cups in a hot oven, a visual that would become as recognizable as the golden arches. Marketers noticed. Advertising campaigns began positioning pepperoni pizza not as an immigrant food at all, but as a wholesome, all-American family meal, something you ordered on a Friday night, something a Little League team celebrated with, something patriotic in its very ordinariness. The irony here is worth sitting with for a moment. A sausage invented by immigrant butchers, using a foreign word borrowed loosely and incorrectly from Italian, mass-produced through industrial refrigeration and standardized food science, was rebranded within a couple of decades as the quintessential symbol of American comfort food. Nobody selling pepperoni pizza in 1965 was advertising it as an ethnic specialty. They were advertising it as normal, as default, as what pizza simply was. Full stop. That reframing is not an accident of taste. It is a masterclass in cultural laundering through branding, one that stripped away the immigrant fingerprints on the product, while keeping the product itself intact. By the time chains were competing on delivery speed and topping variety, pepperoni had already won the war for topping supremacy, not through some inherent superiority of flavor, but through a perfect alignment of industrial timing, marketing instinct, and postwar appetite. If you are enjoying uncovering how deliberately engineered our most mundane foods actually are, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the story is about to take a considerably darker turn. Darker, because the same industrial machinery that made pepperoni cheap, uniform, and ubiquitous also made it dangerous in ways nobody was advertising. By the 1960s and 1970s, food scientists and government chemists began raising alarms about a class of chemical preservatives that had quietly become standard in almost every cured meat product in America, pepperoni included. Sodium nitrite and sodium nitrate were the workhorses of the processed meat industry, added not for flavor, but for function. They gave cured meat its pink color, they slowed the growth of bacteria, and most critically, they suppressed the spores of Clostridium botulinum, the organism responsible for botulism, one of the most lethal food poisonings known. Without nitrites, mass-produced pepperoni sitting in warehouses and delivery trucks for days or weeks would have been a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. With them, it was shelf-stable, pink, and perpetually appetizing looking. But the same chemistry that made pepperoni safe from one killer opened the door to another concern entirely. Researchers discovered that under certain conditions, particularly high heat, nitrites could react with naturally occurring amines in meat to form nitrosamines, compounds shown in laboratory studies to be carcinogenic in animals. Suddenly, the crisp, curled, blackened edges of a pepperoni slice, the exact visual signature that made it so recognizable on a pizza, became a subject of scientific scrutiny rather than simple appetite appeal. Consumer advocates and insider researchers, some working from within government health agencies, began publishing findings that cast a shadow over an entire category of American food. Newspapers picked up the story. The phrase cancer-causing preservative started appearing next to the word bacon and, by extension, pepperoni, in headlines that made grocery shoppers pause in the deli aisle. Think about that for a second. A product that had spent 2 decades being marketed as wholesome, patriotic, and safe was now being quietly re-examined as a potential health hazard, and the manufacturers who had built entire product lines around it were suddenly playing defense. Regulatory bodies responded by tightening the rules rather than banning the chemical outright, since removing nitrites entirely brought back the specter of botulism, arguably the greater immediate danger. New limits were placed on how much sodium nitrite could be used per unit of meat, and manufacturers were required to add ascorbates or erythorbates, compounds that block the chemical pathway that forms nitrosamines in the first place. Reformulation was not optional. Every major processor of pepperoni in the country had to adjust their recipes, retrain their curing processes, and resubmit their products for approval. A nationwide overhaul triggered not by a single scandal, but by a slow accumulation of laboratory evidence and public pressure that regulators could no longer ignore. It is a quietly remarkable moment in food history, precisely because it is so unglamorous. No single villain, no dramatic courtroom scene, just chemists, epidemiologists, and cautious bureaucrats slowly forcing an entire industry to change its formula for something Americans ate by the billions of slices a year. The pepperoni that came out the other side of this regulatory reckoning was chemically safer, more tightly specified, and more heavily regulated than the product that went in. But to the average consumer biting into a slice at a birthday party, nothing appeared to have changed at all. That invisibility is, in its own way, the whole point. By the 1980s, pepperoni had stopped being a strictly American story and started becoming a global one. American fast food chains and franchise pizza brands expanded overseas, carrying pepperoni with them into markets that had never seen anything like it. And the topping that started as a Mulberry Street butcher's improvisation was suddenly showing up on menus in Tokyo, Riyadh, and Reykjavik. But globalization did not simply mean exporting a finished product. It meant the product itself started to mutate again, adapting to local supply chains, religious dietary restrictions, and regional palates, the same way it had once adapted to American ones. In Muslim-majority countries, beef or turkey-based pepperoni replaced the traditional pork blend to comply with halal requirements. And in parts of Asia, manufacturers leaned into sweeter, milder spice profiles suited to local taste, while in Australia and the UK, pepperoni sat alongside indigenous cured meats as just one option among many, rather than the default. The most American of pizza toppings had become, paradoxically, a blank template onto which other cultures projected their own culinary rules. Meanwhile, back home, the industry was quietly fighting a war most consumers never noticed, the battle over casings. Traditional sausage casings are made from cleaned animal intestine, and natural casing gives pepperoni its distinctive snap when bitten into, the little resistance before the give. But natural casing is expensive, inconsistent in diameter, and dependent on global livestock supply chains that can be disrupted by disease outbreaks, trade disputes, or simple scarcity. Collagen casings, manufactured from processed hide, became the industrial answer, cheaper and uniform. But purists and old-line butchers have never fully accepted them as equivalent, and the tension between natural and synthetic casing remains a quiet fault line in the industry to this day, invisible on the plate, but very much alive in the supply contracts. Then, there was the panic. In 2014, meat industry trade press and mainstream news outlets alike ran a wave of stories warning of an impending pepperoni shortage, driven by a spike in pork belly prices after a pig virus called porcine epidemic diarrhea swept through American hog populations, killing millions of piglets and tightening pork supply nationwide. Pizza chains and consumers alike briefly treated this as a looming national emergency, with headlines warning that the price of pizza itself might rise, and it is worth pausing on that for a second. An entire country momentarily anxious not about oil, not about grain, but about the price of spicy sausage on a flatbread. The shortage never fully materialized in the way headlines predicted, but the panic itself revealed something real, that pepperoni had become so structurally embedded in American food culture that its scarcity registered as a genuine cultural threat, not just a market fluctuation. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden infrastructure behind everyday food, consider subscribing, because these stories about how ordinary products conceal extraordinary histories are exactly what this channel exists to uncover. What the shortage scare and the casing wars and the global rebranding all reveal is the same underlying truth. Pepperoni had long since stopped being a fixed recipe and had become an adaptable industrial system, one flexible enough to be reformulated for regulators, re-engineered for religious markets, and reimagined for entirely new national palates, all while somehow remaining recognizably itself, that same crisped red-orange disc, no matter which continent it landed on. So let's return to where we started. More than a third of all pizzas ordered in America today come topped with pepperoni, an object so common that it barely registers as a choice anymore. It's just what pizza is. But you now know what that crisped red-orange disc is actually carrying. It is carrying the memory of an orsino in the old country, cutting prosciutto by hand for a market that had no word for what would come next. It is carrying the improvisation of immigrant butchers on Mulberry Street and in East Harlem, men who took hog's bread for American slaughterhouses, ground them with beef, and reached for paprika and cayenne instead of the sweet peppers their grandmothers might have used, simply because that was what the moment demanded. It is carrying the hum of postwar meatpacking plants and refrigerated trucks, the same industrial machinery that turned a neighborhood specialty into a shelf-stable national commodity. It is carrying the returning soldier's craving for something he tasted overseas, repackaged by admen into the most American meal imaginable. It is carrying the quiet chemistry of ascorbates added to a curing recipe after regulators and researchers forced an entire industry to answer for what nitrites were doing at high heat. And it is carrying the scars of a global supply chain, stretched thin by a virus that killed piglets by the million, reformulated for halal markets, softened for palates on the other side of the planet, and still, through all of it, instantly recognizable on a pizza box lid from Ohio to Osaka. None of this was planned. There was no committee that sat down in 1900 and designed the topping that would come to define American pizza. There was no Italian ancestor waiting to be imported, no ancient recipe smuggled across the Atlantic in a steamer trunk. Pepperoni is not a tradition that survived immigration. It is a byproduct of immigration itself, an accident of adaptation, economics, and timing that industrial capacity and marketing genius later mistook, quite successfully, for destiny. That is, in the end, the real story hiding under the cheese. Not an heirloom, but an improvisation that got industrialized, regulated, exported, and mythologized until nobody thought to question it anymore. Pepperoni didn't survive history. It was built by it, one decision at a time, by butchers who needed to sell meat, admen who needed to sell pizza, regulators who needed to prevent poisoning, and a hungry public that never asked where any of it came from. So the next time a delivery box lands on your counter, and you lift that lid to the smell of paprika and rendered fat, remember that you are not looking at a recipe passed down through centuries. You are looking at an accident that became an industry that became a habit, and a habit that became, against every odd, an American icon.